I will be talking about digital library software and evaluation criteria. Of course, in this slide I will be only mentioning what software are there instead of going in depth about each software, but definitely more about the evaluation criteria, so that when somebody chooses which software should be used, they can go through the evaluation criteria. I remember when I was guiding one of my students about evaluating digital library software, I told her, don't say this is the best software, because basically I believe there is nothing called best for all contexts. Some are better for some contexts over the others, but the same software may not be very good in some other context, just as in the case of digital images. Just we covered in digitization, there are some formats which have their advantages and disadvantages. So, I believe every software has its advantages and disadvantages. Some are more suitable for some circumstances and some are more suitable in different contexts. So, just to give a glimpse of software available for digital libraries or institutional repositories, actually there is technically from software point of view, there is no difference between digital library and institutional repository or thematic or subject repositories. Software is common for all these. It is only the scope of the content that makes it this is an institutional repository, this is a subject based repository, like that. Okay. Now, there are many open source software, some have become more popular, some have been less popular, some may be only more as an experimental ones, like the open source software Arno, which is named after a river in Europe, then Opus, CDS Invenio. This is of course from CERN Labs, which created the browsers also. Then Docs, DSpace, EPrints, Fedora Commons, Greenstone, MyCore, these are all open source software. But we have commercial ones also, which I haven't really tested for the simple reason, as they are commercial, I could not lay my hands on them. Besides, of course, I prefer always, my bias is towards open source software. Then commercial ones are BEPress Digital Commons, then Content DM, Digitool, Hyperion, InMagic Presto, Vital. These are commercial digital library software. Now, what are the evaluation criteria? Because we have a number of digital repository software and we have to evaluate them before we make a choice for implementing our own digital repository or institutional repository. Then what are the, we know that basically we have to see whether it is browser based. Good old days, I think many software, for example, in the library automation software also, we were looking whether it is GUI based, okay, graphic user interface is there, so that easier to use. But nowadays we emphasize more on browser based software. I think before we adopt or buy any software, we see whether it is browser based. One of the greatest advantages of having a browser based software is the server which is running the software can be accessed on any machine from a LAN or an internet, depending on whether the IP is an internet IP or a LAN IP. But for the end user who is accessing the system from a client, practically it is transparent on which server it is being hosted. For example, when we make a search on the internet on Google, for example, do we know which server we are accessing? Practically we do not know, because that is the magic of the browser based software, because it becomes computer independent or operating system independent or even application software independent, as long as it is accessible through a browser. Then another criteria is whether it is requires a huge hardware, expensive hardware, or huge commercial expensive software. This is very important. For example, sometimes some of the open source software may have a commercial component. Okay. The problem with that is unless you spend on the commercial component of it, you are not allowed to use it. So, we have to make sure when we adopt a software whether it is using any commercial components. Normally many software are prepared so using components from which were already available, something like software tools. For example, in case of DSpace, it uses PostgreSQL software, which is an open source software. You can also use Oracle, which is a commercial one. Okay. So, if you don't want to spend, probably in DSpace you should choose PostgreSQL software rather than an Oracle DBMS software. So is the case with hardware. In fact, I know many a time people keep asking me to host a digital repository, what kind of hardware do we require. In the beginning, our own librarians digital library, when we didn't have money, we ran on a PC only. Only thing is we have put it on an internet IP based server so that people could access it. But again, the size of the hardware depends on how many digital documents you have, how many people may be accessing simultaneously. So, there are many other criteria, okay, to decide whether you have to go for a very huge hardware. But to run DSpace as such, perhaps you may not require big hardware, but this hardware scaling depends on how many documents, whether how many images or videos you have, then how many people will be accessing your computer. So, maybe you require a server or any other better machine. So is the case with software, whether you want to go for Fedora Commons or EPrints or some commercial software like BEpress, you have to decide how much fat pocket you have. Then multi-user, of course this goes without saying because many people may be accessing simultaneously your digital repository. So the single user system days are over, okay, because nowadays even operating systems, good old days DOS and Windows 95, those are gone. I think everybody uses multi-user systems, and normally many of these software you can access through some Apache web server, which is again a multi-user software. Now, other criteria are whether it is modular and extensible. That is, if it is modular, that every component of the digital library software is split into modules, okay, so that if you want to customize, you customize only a module without affecting the rest of the modules. That is the advantage of modular programming. And of course, we know that in the history even programming languages evolved from Fortran basic days to modular programming, then you have object oriented programming. In object oriented programming, of course, they are all modular approach. So, if you want to allow more features, of course, this you can do only in case of open source software, or facilitate application program interfaces. For example, the latest version of DSpace has a REST protocol interface. That means anybody can develop application programs using the REST protocol and can access the content of the digital library. Then functionality should have maximum functionality. Of course, everybody desires to have more and more features to a software, and normally when we develop software in the academic circles, we are more worried about functionality rather than user friendliness. But in commercial ones, they have to emphasize in the user friendly interface in addition to the functionality. Then scalability should accommodate large number of digital objects. As far as I know, DSpace about a few years back was tested on data with 10 terabytes. Still it is working. We know that scalability is very important when digital repository becoming more and more populated. Instead of migrating to another system and all that, so you have to choose scalability is a scalable hardware where you can add lot of hardware to it, and whether the system also supports the scalability. Probably that was one reason why DSpace went for PostgreSQL rather than MySQL. MySQL is very fast compared to Postgres, but Postgres is more scalable. That means every system has a limit, an upper limit. It does not mean that every system can take infinite number of objects or infinite scaling. Okay, only thing is, I think this is obvious when people access results of some net exam or something. At a time when many people access, I think the system collapses. So this is of course scalability with regard to networking aspects. So we have to ensure whether the software is scalable from the point of view of the large digital objects or many number of people accessing over a network. So another criteria is interoperability. Interoperability allows integration with other software, supports import and exports data. So we know that interoperability means the compatibility of the images and software and all these should be ensured to make sure the data and the software are interoperable. Okay. Allows migration. Migration means if you have data in open standard, okay, say for example you are following Dublin core, okay, and you want to export or exchange the data through OAI PMH, which is basically meant for data exchange, protocol for data exchange. So if it is in Dublin core, any other system which is using Dublin core, which is another W3 approved standard, you can easily import and export data across any number of systems. That is the reason why we always look whether the system is interoperable, whether the data is interoperable. This is the case with even library automation software. For example, if you want to export your cataloging data, say if it is in Mark 21, okay, so you can download that or import that data in any software whichever is following Mark 21 format. That is the reason we look for standards. That is why standards are very, very important to make the systems interoperable. If it is open standards, of course, it is even more interoperable. Complete interoperability can ensure if systems follow open standards. So that is the reason we cannot overemphasize the importance of interoperability. Then ease of installation. So whether anybody can install the software and configure it easily. My own experience is as Greenstone software is very, very simple to install, just as it runs on both of course Linux and Windows software, just a click of a button it gets installed. That way I think it scores better than any other software regarding digital libraries. Ease of installation. Relatively probably DSpace is a little more complicated to install the software. Okay. But again my experience is use of the software DSpace perhaps much simpler than Greenstone. That means one has to put more effort in installation, but usage is much easier in case of DSpace. In case of Greenstone, ease of use installation, which is one time job, but everyday usage is a little more complex than that of DSpace. So, that is why the so called user friendliness is a relative word. What is user friendly? I think one of the most misused words in the software industry is user friendliness. My belief is the most user friendly software is I do not have to learn anything, I stand in front of the computer and issue the commands. Show me who draws the highest salary in my organization. The system should respond in voice, so and so gets the maximum salary. Whereas any other software where you have to use your before using you have to learn the software is not exactly user friendly. Say compare this any computer software with that of a washing machine or a vacuum cleaner. You can learn how to use them within 2-3 minutes, whereas using a computer, of course I do accept computer has a multitasking mode. I mean it can do more than one job, unlike the case with washing machines, it can do only washing, it cannot do cooking. Okay. Anyhow, other evaluation criteria is system performance, whether the system performs well with load balancing features. Usually, for example, Tomcat and Apache, all these software have load balancing feature, where now and then the system takes care of the load, that means many people accessing the system, how do you balance it. Even the PostgreSQL software also has load balancing features. So, load balancing is very important, not only the system overall, the components in the system like database management systems or web interfaces or servlet containers like Tomcat or Racine or Jetty, where you can run JSP based software. Then platform support. Naturally, this is important because if the software says that it can be used only in Windows operating system, that means you cannot use the software on any other operating system. This I think limits your choice. In fact, you should be free. For example, if there is a software which runs only on Linux systems, but in your office you have Windows systems, then obviously you cannot use the software. So, a software, an ideal software you should be able to install and use it on any platform. In fact, this is one of the greatest advantages of open source software. Many of the open source software you can compile on any operating system, whereas the commercial software normally are distributed in as binary files of a particular operating system. That means if you buy the software for Windows operating system, tomorrow the same software you cannot use on some Linux. Whereas open source software, for example DSpace, only thing is you have to take the extra effort of compiling the software on each of the operating systems you wish to use. That is the reason I think mostly by default open source software support many a platform. They are practically platform independent, except sometimes they may be some hitches. Then popularity. Popularity is one of the important features. Of course, this goes by the rule of the thumb. More popular means probably it is a better system, but it does not mean always. For example, personally I feel Linux is a better operating system than Microsoft Windows, but again Microsoft Windows is the most popular operating system. So, But again, in general, the rule of thumb is popularity. We may sometimes jump to the conclusion probably it is better. Okay, like the most popular leader is a good leader. I leave it to your choice. Then documentation. Documentation is very important. Usually commercial software, they provide very good documentation. One of the weaknesses of many an open source software is you may not find documentation because usually the open source software people, the developers or programmers, they are more interested in the programming rather than documentation. That is the reason many of the open source software people say you can contribute to the software by preparing a good documentation. That means if you are a good supporter of open source software, even if you do not know programming, you can still help them in preparing good user guides or tutorials and other things, so that the popularity of the software increases by manifold. Yeah. So that means in the context of open source software, you need not be a programmer. Even if you are a user, you can contribute towards good documentation. Perhaps you can point out the bugs to the developers so that they rectify the bugs. Of course, that is the case with even commercial software. Commercial software does not mean that they are completely bug free. Any software would have some bugs which are normally in use. Users point out what the bugs are. In the next versions, always they try to fix the bugs. Of course, in the process they may add a few more bugs, but again it is an unending process making the software bug free. But good documentation, tutorials and lessons, and probably you might have seen, if you go to some of these open source software also, many people develop lessons and host it on their home page, or sometimes even you may go to YouTube and find out a lot of tutorials and lessons for both commercial and open source software. For example, the latest Hadoop technology in big data context, you have scores and scores of video lessons on YouTube. But in addition to that, a good tutorial books or guides or user guides are essential for the success of any software. So another is how much the support it has through various user groups or forums. And you know, many software are supported by user groups, especially the open source software. If you have any doubt, go to user group and pose the question, I have this problem and how to solve it. Probably somebody would answer you who has already burnt his fingers with the same problem. Okay. So it could be a problem, or it could be somebody wants a solution, or somebody, they do bug reporting. Sometimes when users don't get answers, probably the developer team members are also part of the user forum. They note down, okay, this is an unresolved bug, okay, because there is no solution. So when they try to fix the bugs in the next version, they will go through the mails being generated by user groups or the user forums. So DSpace has at various levels the forums are there, for at a developer's level, at a user level, like that. So these are communities of users or developers who constantly support the system and try to improve, or sometimes in these forums they may give wish list. So active development is one of the important things for any software. So for example, if you go to SourceForge or GitHub, probably you see percentile of activity. That means if the developers are active, that means they keep on bringing out the new versions. And obviously these developers should have a clear roadmap, what should be the future developments, what features it should have and other things. And again, any digital library software, you require the metadata, what kind of metadata it supports. Of course, W3C approved standard is Dublin core, but there are many other metadata schema one can follow. So, evaluation criteria, search and retrieval, whether the search engine supports various mechanisms. DSpace uses one of the most powerful search engines, which is an open source search engine, Lucene. So, the search features like whether it has incremental indexing, page ranking and other things are important. And even more important is what kind of standards and protocols the software supports, especially the open standards and open protocols. So, whether it supports Unicode, so that a multilingual digital library you can develop, and OAI-PMH for data exchange and aggregation, then OR for object reuse and exchange, Dublin core and various W3C related software. For long term preservation, of course, it should support versioning of digital objects. Whenever something is changed, you should have a record of it. Security is one of the most important things, whether the system is much more secure from unauthorized. DSpace, if you wish, you can run on HTTPS. And disaster protection, always of course anything can happen with the software or hardware and even the building that is hosting it. So, but anyhow, leaving the building part apart, whether this software supports recovery. Okay. Then transaction log analysis are important for usage statistics, which justifies the expenditure spent on the digital repository. Copyright licensing issues are very important. We know that in the open access initiative presentation we covered that. Persistent IDs should be there because without that aggregation is not possible. A clear cut workflow, DSpace has a clear cut workflow policy. So, these are some of the software. Now, when it comes to the popularity of the software, I would like to mention DSpace, of course, almost 43.6% of the people. This is the open door statistics which I collected from 3,100 repositories. Then the next popular is EPrints, about 13.7. I know that many people who are using DSprints are slowly migrating to DSpace. Next, of course, is many things unknown, and Opus is another popular, and Digital Commons is another popular software. So, based on this, of course, definitely popularity and many regards, DSpace is most popular software among the digital library software. With that, I think we conclude.